The wind howled over an endless expanse of golden dunes, carrying with it the scent of dust, heat, and eternity. Each gust carved new ripples into the sand, like an invisible hand etching waves upon a frozen sea. The sun had just begun its climb above the horizon, and in its early light, the desert seemed infinite save for a single miracle of green that sliced through the barren land. There, glistening under the morning sun, the Nile wound like a silver-blue serpent, its waters sparkling as though kissed by the gods. To those who lived near its banks, the river was not merely water, it was life itself. Over 5 millennia ago, when much of North Africa lay under the dominion of the desert, a handful of small, scattered communities discovered that this mighty river held a secret. It could defy the desert's hunger. Each year, as if by divine command, the Nile would rise in a great swelling flood, spilling across its banks and drowning the land in dark, rich silt. This was no ordinary earth. It was fertile, soft, and fragrant with the promise of life. To the people, this was a gift from the god Hopi, the bringer of abundance, a sacred covenant that bound them to the river forever. They built their homes from the earth itself, shaping mud bricks that baked hard under the sun. At first, their dwellings were modest low huts of reed and klebet. Over generations, villages took shape. Farmers learned to cut narrow canals, guiding the river's blessings deeper inland. The air would come alive with the rustle of barley stalks and the golden shimmer of ripening wheat. Women ground grain into flour on smooth stones, their rhythmic motions accompanied by the laughter of children chasing each other along the shore. The Nile was both road and lifeline. Longboats fashioned from bundles of papyrus reeds began to appear, gliding gracefully along the current. In them, traders carried baskets of fish, skins of beer, jars of honey, and bolts of coarse linen to exchange for copper, turquoise, and incense from distant lands. The river was not a barrier, was a thread that wove together two very different worlds: the rocky, narrow valley of Upper Egypt in the south, and the wide, fertile delta of Lower Egypt in the north. At night, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to tremble, the elders would tell stories. They spoke of gods who ruled the sky, the earth, and the waters, of Osiris, lord of the afterlife, of Isis, the mother who wept for her slain husband, and of Horus, the falcon-eyed protector of kings. These tales were not mere entertainment, they were lore, they were history, they were the truths that explained why the river rose and why the seasons turned. In the flickering firelight, children learned to see themselves not just as farmers or fishermen, but as part of a greater order, a people chosen by the gods to thrive where others would wither. But the river, generous as it was, could not feed every dream. As villages grew into small chiefdoms, the desire for control over fertile fields, fishing rights, and the lucrative river trade began to stir in the hearts of men. Leaders emerged, men of cunning and strength, their power measured in warriors and grain stores. Some traded and allied with neighbors, while others took up spears and sought to claim by force what the river had given. The Nile's gentle current bore not only goods and stories, but also whispers of conflict. And yet, life along the river retained a rhythm older than memory. The year was measured not by months, but by the Nile's moods. Akit, the season of flooding; Pare, the season of planting; Shemu, the season of harvest. Each phase brought its own rituals, its own prayers, its own labor. When the floods came, people gathered on the banks to watch the waters rise, offering loaves of bread and jars of beer to Hopi, singing songs that praised his generosity. When the waters receded, the land lay renewed, ready to feed the people once more. Even the dead belonged to the Nile. The people believed that beyond this life lay another, and that to journey there, one needed both the blessing of the gods and the preservation of the body. Simple burials in shallow graves began to give way to more elaborate rites. Bodies wrapped in linen, grave goods placed by the head, amulets of stone and faience, meant to protect the soul on its voyage to the afterlife. These early customs would one day grow into the grand art of mummification, and the humble tombs into monuments of stone. In the great sweep of history, this was but the dawn of a fragile moment before ambition and conquest would shape the land into an empire. The people of the Nile did not yet know the names of Narmer or Khufu, had never seen the shadow of a pyramid fall across the sand, but in the quiet strength of their daily toil, in the faith they placed in the river's return, in the unity born of shared survival, the foundations were already set. One evening, as the sun sank low and turned the waters to molten gold, an elder of a small riverside village, stood watching the horizon. He saw, not with his eyes but with the memory of generations, the path that stretched ahead. He imagined a day when the scattered villages would stand as one people, when their rulers would be kings touched by the gods, when their temples would pierce the sky and their names would be etched in stone for eternity. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of wet earth from the receding floods. The Nile, eternal and unyielding, whispered softly against the shore. In its voice was the promise of glory and the first stirrings of a civilization that would outlast empires, outshine kings, and defy the grasp of time itself. The Nile, eternal and patient, had watched for centuries as its people built their lives upon its banks. From the rocky cataracts of the south to the wide green delta of the north, its waters had carried more than grain and goods, they had carried ambition. And in the dawn of the third millennium, before the Common Era, that ambition began to take shape in the hearts of men. Two lands stood divided. In the south, Upper Egypt, a narrow strip of fertile soil, hemmed in by cliffs and desert, was home to hardy farmers and warriors, used to defending their precious fields against raiders and the unforgiving sun. Their white crown, tall and conical, was a symbol of resilience and authority. In the north, Lower Egypt, the great delta, was a land of abundance, a labyrinth of waterways, marshes, and lush farmland. Here, trade flowed in from the Mediterranean, and villages thrived on fishing, farming, and commerce. Their red crown, wide and flat, marked a different kind of power, the wealth of the sea and the bounty of the land. For generations, the two lands coexisted uneasily. At times they traded, their boats meeting where the river widened, exchanging grain for papyrus, gold for copper. At other times, skirmishes broke out along disputed borders, where the river's bounty was most contested. The dream of uniting these lands had flickered in the minds of kings before, but it was Narmer, a ruler from the south, who would seize it with unshakable will. Narmer was not merely a warlord, he was a strategist, a man who understood that conquest required more than swords. His early reign saw careful alliances forged through marriage and trade. He sent emissaries bearing gifts of linen and grain to the chieftains of the north, learning their strengths and their divisions. Yet, beneath this diplomacy, he was preparing his army, disciplined men, armed with copper-tipped spears, stone maces, and bows, strung with sinew. When the time came, Narmer struck with precision. His forces moved along the Nile like a great tide, their war boats slicing through the water under banners of white. The first battles were swift, villages falling in quick succession as northern leaders were either brought into allegiance or swept aside. But the heart of Lower Egypt lay deeper in its capital stronghold, defended by seasoned warriors who knew the marshlands better than any outsider. The decisive battle was fought on the borderlands, where the green fields met the desert's edge. The clash was brutal, shields splintering under blows, arrows hissing through the air. Narmer himself fought at the front, his white crown gleaming in the sun, a war mace in his hand. By the day's end, the northern army broke, and their leaders knelt before the king of the south. Victory was not sealed with blood alone, but with a symbol. Narmer donned a new crown, one unlike any the world had seen before, the double crown, merging the white of Upper Egypt and the red of Lower Egypt. It was more than a headdress. It was the declaration of a new era, where two lands would be ruled as one. In a newly unified kingdom, Narmer chose Memphis as his capital, strategically placed where Upper and Lower Egypt met. From here, he could control the flow of the Nile, oversee trade between the Mediterranean and the interior, and maintain the delicate balance between the two once rival realms. Temples rose to honor the gods who had granted victory. Offerings were made to Horus, the falcon god, whom Narmer claimed as his divine patron. Scribes carved the king's triumph into ivory plaques and ceremonial palettes, depicting him smiting his foes under the watchful eye of the gods. These carvings were not mere records, they were propaganda, designed to show all who saw them that Narmer's reign was sanctioned by divine will. For the first time in history, the Nile flowed through a single kingdom. Farmers in the south and north planted their fields under the same laws. Traders paid tribute to the same ruler. A shared identity began to take root, not just as people of the river, but as Egyptians, children of the two lands. But unity brought its own challenges. The vast kingdom had to be held together by more than fear of the king's armies. Narmer began appointing local governors, loyal men charged with collecting taxes, overseeing irrigation, and ensuring order. He established a network of messengers and scribes to carry decrees swiftly along the river's length. Slowly, the machinery of a centralized state began to turn. At night, in Memphis, Narmer would stand on the palace terrace, looking out toward the Nile glinting under the moonlight. He had achieved what no man before him had done. He had bound two lands into one. Yet he knew that the river Esgift could be both blessing and curse, that to keep Egypt whole, each generation of kings would have to guard it with the same strength and cunning that had brought it together. In the shadows of the palace, the future waited. For from this unification would rise dynasties of pharaohs who would carve their names into stone and eternity. The dream of Narmer would live on for millennia, shaping not only Egypt, but the very idea of kingship itself. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under King Narmer had set the stage for something the world had never seen before. Kingdom not merely surviving, but thriving under a single, divine ruler. Over generations, Narmer's descendants strengthened the central authority, expanding trade, developing agriculture, and refining the art of governance. And from this growing stability emerged the Old Kingdom, an era that would define Egypt's image for millennia. It was in this time, around 2700 BCE, that the pharaohs began to dream of eternity in stone. The afterlife was not a vague hope for them, it was a certainty. To the Egyptian mind, death was not an end, but a passage, a continuation of existence in another realm, where one's power and status would endure. The pharaoh, considered the earthly embodiment of Horus and the son of Ra, could not simply vanish into the sands. He had to rise toward the heavens, his legacy immortal. The first great leap toward this immortality came under Pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty. Seeking to build a tomb unlike any before, Djoser turned to his genius architect, Imhotep, a man whose name would be remembered for centuries. Imhotep envisioned something revolutionary, a tomb of stone, not mud brick, one that rose in steps toward the sky. On the desert plateau of Saqqara, work began. Teams of laborers, farmers during the off-season, hauled massive limestone blocks from nearby quarries. They carved and placed them with precision, guided by foremen who followed plans inscribed on papyrus. Day after day, the structure grew, tier by tier, until it stood as the Step Pyramid, the first monumental stone building in human history. At over 60 meters tall, it dominated the landscape, a stairway for the king's soul to ascend to the gods. The Step Pyramid was more than a tomb, it was the centerpiece of a vast complex. Surrounding it were courtyards for ritual dances, temples for offerings, and chapels for priests to maintain the pharaoh's cult. Long after his death, the entire structure was enclosed by a high wall, shielding it from the desert winds and intruders, a silent fortress guarding the king's eternity. But the pharaohs were not satisfied. The generations that followed sought to outdo their predecessors. The Fourth Dynasty, in particular, would see the perfection of the pyramid form, transforming the stepped design into smooth-sided monuments of unparalleled grandeur. The greatest of these builders was Pharaoh Snefru, a master of experimentation. His reign produced not one, but 3 pyramids, each refining the craft. First came the Medum Pyramid, which collapsed due to structural flaws. Then the bent pyramid at Dosha, with its curious change in angle halfway up, an engineering adjustment to prevent another disaster. Finally, Snefru achieved perfection with the Red Pyramid, the first true smooth-sided pyramid, glowing crimson in the setting sun. Snefru's son would take this ambition to heights no one had imagined. Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, commissioned a pyramid that would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid of Giza, standing over 146 meters tall. It was a marvel of precision, more than 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, fitted so tightly that not even a blade of copper could slip between them. The construction was a feat of organization as much as labor. Contrary to the myth of slaves, the workforce was largely composed of skilled laborers and seasonal workers, housed in well-planned camps near the site. They were fed bread, beer, and meat, and their work was a matter of national pride, an offering to the gods and to the eternal pharaoh. Beside Khufu's pyramid rose those of his successors, Khafre, whose pyramid still retains some of its gleaming white casing stones at the top, and Menkaure, smaller but refined, clad in granite. Guarding this sacred necropolis was the enigmatic Great Sphinx, its lion's body and human face believed to bear the likeness of Khafre, watching over the desert with an eternal gaze. To the Egyptians, these structures were not mere monuments, they were living entities, imbued with divine power. Priests performed daily rituals in the mortuary temples, presenting offerings of bread, beer, fruit, and incense to sustain the king's soul. The pyramids stood as bridges between the mortal world and the divine. Their precise alignment with the cardinal points and celestial bodies reflecting a cosmic order the pharaoh was sworn to uphold. The age of the pyramids was more than an age of stone, it was an age of confidence, where Egypt saw itself as the center of the world. Trade caravans brought cedar from Lebanon, copper from Sinai, and gold from Nubia. Artisans crafted jewelry of lapis lazuli and turquoise, their colors as vivid as the Nile's waters. Scribes recorded the deeds of kings in elegant hieroglyphs, ensuring their names would live forever. And yet, beneath the splendor, the seeds of challenge were already sown. The immense cost of pyramid building strained the kingdom's resources. Power began to shift subtly toward the provincial governors, whose wealth and influence grew as they managed the pharaoh's far-reaching lands. But for now, the horizon was filled with triumph. The sun rose each morning to cast its first light upon gleaming limestone, and the people of Egypt knew they were part of something eternal. In the shadow of the pyramids, they saw proof that their pharaohs could defy time itself. The old kingdom would not last forever, but the pyramids would. Even when dynasties fell and sands reclaimed cities, these colossal tombs would remain, whispering across the ages of an era when human ambition touched the sky. In the shadow of the great pyramids, the air was thick with the scent of incense and the murmurs of prayers. Egypt was not only a land of stone and river, it was a land of gods. To the ancient Egyptians, every breath of wind, every rise and fall of the Nile, every grain of wheat that sprouted from the soil was the work of divine hands. Life was a tapestry woven with myth, ritual, and a cosmic order they called the balance and harmony of the universe. The pantheon of eternal powers, the gods of Egypt, were as numerous and varied as the lands along the Nile. Some were cosmic, their realms vast as the heavens. Others were local protectors, guardians of a single city or village. At the heart of it all stood Ra, the sun god, who sailed across the sky in his golden bark by day and journeyed through the underworld by night, battling the serpent of chaos, Apophis. Each sunrise was not merely the dawn, it was Ra's triumph, renewing the world for another day. Beside him, in reverence, stood Osiris, lord of the afterlife, the green-skinned king who once ruled Egypt in life before being slain and dismembered by his jealous brother Set. Through the devotion of his wife, the goddess Isis, Osiris was resurrected not to walk the living world again, but to reign as the eternal judge of the dead. From their union came Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship, whose vigilant eyes watched over the pharaoh and the land. Anubis, jackal-headed and solemn, guarded the tombs and guided souls to the hall of judgment. There, before Osiris himself, the heart of the deceased would be weighed against the feather of Mat. A heart heavy with sin would be devoured by Amit, the fearsome crocodile lion, hippopotamus beast. But a heart light with truth would pass on to the field of Giza, perfect mirror of Egypt, where the Nile flowed forever and harvests never failed. Other gods held sway over more earthly matters. Hopi brought the Nile floods. Hathor, goddess of love and music, blessed celebrations and childbirth. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, recorded every decree in divine script. Each god was not an abstract symbol. They were living forces, present in temples, statues, and the very landscape. The pharaoh as god-king in this world, steeped in divine presence. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was the living Horus, the son of Ra, the intermediary between mortals and gods. His word was law because it was divine command. When he led armies, it was as Horus defending the land. When he performed rituals, it was as Ra ensuring the sun's return. Coronation ceremonies were acts of cosmic renewal, reaffirming Mat and the pharaoh's role in sustaining it. Wearing the double crown, holding the crook and flail, he embodied both the shepherd and the enforcer, guiding and protecting his people. To disobey the pharaoh was not just treason, it was sacrilege, an offense against the gods themselves. Temples were not places for public worship, as in later religions. They were the private houses of the gods, maintained by priests on behalf of the pharaoh. Each day, rituals were performed. The god's statue was bathed, clothed, and presented with food, drink, and incense. Hymns were sung, and sacred texts recited, ensuring that the deity's favor would remain upon Egypt. The sacred landscape, the land itself, was seen as a map of divine power. The east bank of the Nile, where the sun rose, was the realm of the living. Cities and temples flourished there. The west bank, where the sun set, belonged to the dead. Here lay the necropolises, the tombs, and the pyramids, waiting to guide souls into the afterlife. The seasons themselves mirrored the gods' eternal cycles. The inundation of the Nile was the tears of Isis mourning Osiris, bringing life to the land. The harvest was Horus's victory over Set, a time of abundance after struggle. The unchanging flow of these cycles reinforced the belief that Egypt's survival depended on honoring the gods and maintaining Ma. At myth in power and politics, pharaohs skillfully wove myth into their reigns. Victory in battle might be depicted as the pharaoh striking down enemies under the gaze of Horus, or as Set's forces being defeated once more. Diplomacy, too, was framed in divine terms. Alliances were blessings from the gods, and foreign tribute was tribute not just to the king, but to Egypt's entire pantheon. Inscriptions carved deep into temple walls told these stories in hieroglyphs, ensuring that future generations and even the gods themselves would remember the pharaoh's deeds. To erase a name from these walls was the ultimate condemnation, a second death that stripped a soul from eternity. Faith, as the foundation of civilization, religion, was not separate from daily life, it was daily life. Farmers offered the first sheaves of grain to Hopi. Fishermen whispered prayers to Sobek, the crocodile god, before venturing into deep waters. Mothers wore amulets of Toret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, to protect their children. And above it all stood the great temples, rising from the desert like islands of stone. Their massive pylons carved with scenes of gods and kings, their courtyards filled with the scent of lotus and papyrus. Here, priests and pharaoh worked together to maintain the harmony of the cosmos, believing that if the rituals ceased, chaos would consume the world. In this deep intertwining of myth, faith, and power, Egypt found its unshakable identity. The gods were not distant, they were here, in the river's rise, in the gleam of gold on temple doors, in the voice of the king. And so long as Pharaoh upheld Mat, Egypt would endure. But even in the age of divine order, shadows were lengthening on the horizon. Rivalries within the court, the growing independence of provincial governors, and the strain of monumental building projects whispered of challenges yet to come. The gods would be called upon not just to bless the land, but to defend it. The age of the pyramids had cast Egypt in the glow of eternal greatness, but glory, like the floodwaters of the Nile, could not remain at its height forever. After centuries of centralized power under the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, cracks began to spread through the golden facade. Provincial governors, once loyal servants of the crown, grew in wealth and ambition, passing authority to their sons, as if their positions were hereditary thrones. Temples and estates amassed their own resources, rivaling the pharaoh's treasuries. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the carefully woven web of harmony between gods, king, and people was fraying. The Nile's floods became erratic. Famine whispered through the land, and in the vacuum of waning central power, local rulers claimed authority over their own nomes. Egypt splintered into a patchwork of territories, each defending its own borders, each wary of its neighbor. Historians would later call this the first intermediate period, a century and a half, where the land of the two crowns was no longer one. And yet, as the sun rises after the darkest night, so too would Egypt find its way back to unity. The spark came from Thebes, a southern city whose rulers carried themselves with quiet determination. Among them was a man named Imhotep II, a warrior king whose heart burned with the vision of a single Egypt restored. Imhotep's campaign was as much a war of endurance as of battle. For years he pressed northward, forging alliances with some provinces and crushing resistance in others. His army, disciplined and relentless, fought in the heat of the desert and in the green heart of the delta, carrying the banners of Upper Egypt. By the 39th year of his reign, the last rival in Heracleopolis was defeated. The red and white crowns were reunited upon a single brow, and the Middle Kingdom was born, an era of balance and renewal. The Middle Kingdom, beginning around 2055 BCE, did not seek glory through monuments of impossible scale. Imhotep and his successors had learned from the excesses that drained the Old Kingdom. This was a time of measured ambition, of focusing on the strength of Egypt's heart rather than the height of its tombs. Kings invested in irrigation projects, expanding arable land and taming the Nile's caprice with canals and basins. Fortresses rose in Nubia, to protect trade routes and secure access to gold mines. Diplomacy blossomed alongside military might. Egyptian envoys sailed to Byblus for cedar, trekked to Punt for incense, and traded with the Levant for copper and fine oils. The capital shifted north to Ichtuar, a city whose name meant Caesar of the two lands. From here, pharaohs could oversee both Upper and Lower Egypt with equal vigilance, their court alive with scribes, artisans, and priests. The state bureaucracy flourished, refining the collection of taxes, the recording of harvests, and the distribution of resources, art and literature in a new light. The Middle Kingdom marked a flowering of Egyptian culture. Art took on a more human, introspective tone. Statues of pharaohs no longer showed only idealized youth and perfection. They bore lined faces, heavy-lidded eyes, and the weight of rulership, a subtle message that kingship was service as much as privilege. Literature, too, flourished. Works like the Tale of Shinar, the Instruction of Amenhotep, and the story of the shipwrecked sailor revealed a society deeply engaged with questions of loyalty, destiny, and the unpredictable will of the gods. These were stories for the people as well as for the elite, copied by scribes and recited in courts and temples. The pharaoh as shepherd. In the Middle Kingdom, the pharaoh's image shifted subtly. No longer a distant, untouchable god-king, he was also seen as a shepherd to his flock, a ruler whose duty was to protect the vulnerable, feed the hungry, and ensure justice. The concept of Mat deepened, becoming not just cosmic order, but also social order, fairness in judgment, honesty in trade, and care for the widow and orphan. Kings like Senusret I and Amenhotep III embodied this vision. They expanded Egypt's borders through military campaigns, but also poured resources into temple building and agricultural reform. Amenemhat II, in particular, oversaw vast irrigation works in the Fayum, transforming it into a breadbasket for the kingdom. Nubia and the southern frontier. Egypt's gaze turned southward. Nubia, rich in gold, ivory, and exotic goods, was both a trading partner and a potential rival. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom constructed a chain of massive fortresses along the Nile's southern reaches, Giza and Semna monuments, not of stone for the afterlife, but of stone for the living defense of the realm. These strongholds projected Egypt's power deep into Nubia, securing its resources for the pharaoh's coffers. The seeds of the next storm. For nearly 4 centuries, the Middle Kingdom upheld stability and prosperity, but no dynasty is immune to time. Later rulers, less capable than their forebears, allowed cracks to appear in the well-maintained system. The southern forts that once guarded against Nubian rivals would one day be abandoned. And far to the northeast, a new and unfamiliar people, the Hyksos, were beginning to stir. They would come not as conquering armies at first, but as traders, settlers, and mercenaries. In time, they would take advantage of Egypt's complacency, and the two lands would again fall into division. But that is another chapter. For now, under the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt shone once more a realm of ordered fields, flowing trade, and proud temples. The lesson of Mentuhotep's victory lingered, that unity, once lost, could be found again, and that the river's gift belonged to those strong enough to guard it. The Middle Kingdom had restored unity and stability to the two lands, but Egypt's fate was never to remain still. After centuries of relative peace, a new threat rose from the northeast. The Hyksos, foreign rulers from the Levant, entered Egypt as traders and settlers, but soon gained control over the delta. With their mastery of the horse-drawn chariot and superior bronze weapons, they established their own dynasty in Lower Egypt. For more than a century, Egypt was split once again. The Hyksos ruled the north from their capital at Avaris, while native Egyptian kings clung to power in the south at Thebes. Trade routes were disrupted, temples fell into neglect, and the very idea of the pharaoh as an invincible god-king was shaken. Yet Egypt's spirit had not been broken. From Thebes, Seqenin Dao began the struggle to expel the Hyksos, a fight that would cost him his life. His mummified body, discovered millennia later, bore deep battle wounds, a testament to his courage. His son Komos continued the war, pushing the Hyksos back, and it was Ozai, Seqenon's youngest son, who delivered the final blow. Around 1550 BCE, Iamos drove the invaders from the delta, reclaimed the two lands, and crowned himself the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Thus began the new kingdom of Egypt's most glorious age, when it would cease to be merely a unified realm and become an empire. An empire forged by war, the Hyksos occupation had left a deep scar on Egypt's pride, and the pharaohs of the new kingdom were determined it would never happen again. They transformed their armies, adopting the chariot, composite bow, and improved armor. The pharaoh was now not only the keeper of Mat, but also Egypt's greatest warrior, expected to lead campaigns far beyond the Nile Valley. Under Thutmose I and his successors, Egypt expanded deep into Nubia to secure its gold mines, and into the Levant to control vital trade routes. The army became a tool of both conquest and diplomacy, bringing vassal states into Egypt's orbit and flooding the royal treasury with tribute. Hatshepsut, the pharaoh who was king among the rulers of this golden age, one stands apart. Hatshepsut, the queen who crowned herself pharaoh. After the death of her husband, Thutmose II, she initially served as regent for her stepson, Thutmose III. But within a few years, she took the full titles and regalia of kingship, even being depicted with the false beard of a pharaoh. Hatshepsut's reign was marked less by war than by diplomacy and monumental building. She reopened trade with the mysterious land of Punt, sending a grand expedition that returned with incense, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari rose in graceful terraces against the cliffs of western Thebes, a masterpiece of harmony between architecture and nature. For over 2 decades, Egypt prospered under her rule, and when she was gone, her successor, Thutmose III, would carry the kingdom's ambitions back to the battlefield. Thutmose III, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. If Hatshepsut had been the master of diplomacy, Thutmose III was the master of war, leading no fewer than 17 military campaigns. He extended Egypt's influence to its greatest reach from the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia to the Fourth Cataract in Nubia. His victory at the Battle of Megiddo became legendary, a campaign so well organized that it is still studied for its strategic brilliance. Egypt's empire was now a network of conquered territories, allied kingdoms, and tributary states. Gold, grain, and luxury goods poured into the royal storehouses. Foreign princes were brought to Egypt to be educated in the ways of the court, ensuring their loyalty when they returned home. The age of monumental temples with wealth came a building boom that rivaled even the Pyramid Age. The pharaohs of the new kingdom turned their focus from tombs to temples vast, sanctuaries where the gods could dwell and the pharaoh's divine image could be celebrated for eternity. At Karnak, successive kings expanded the great temple of Amun-Ra into a forest of colossal columns and towering obelisks. At Luxor, they built processional avenues lined with sphinxes, linking temple to temple in the grand festivals of the gods. Ramses II, in his turn, carved entire mountains into temples at Abu Simbel, their colossal statues staring out over the Nile as eternal guardians of Egypt's southern frontier. Ramses II, the great builder and the great warrior. Few pharaohs are remembered as vividly as Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, reigning for over 6 decades. He fought the Hittite Empire to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, a clash that ended in one of history's first recorded peace treaties. Ramses adorned Egypt with more monuments than perhaps any other ruler, temples, statues, and inscriptions bearing his name from the Delta to Nubia. His reign symbolized the height of Egypt's wealth and influence, a time when the pharaoh's word could reach across deserts and seas. The sunset of power, but even golden ages fade. Maintaining the empire strained Egypt's resources. The cost of endless campaigns, coupled with internal corruption and pressure from foreign powers, began to weaken the state. The successors of Ramses II struggled to hold together what he had built. By the time of Ramses XI, the central authority had fractured, and Egypt slipped into the Third Intermediate Period, a time of division between rival dynasties in the north and south. Yet the memory of the new kingdom, the glory of Thutmose's conquests, the beauty of Hatshepsut's temple, the grandeur of Ramses' monuments would live on for millennia. This was the age when Egypt was not merely a kingdom by the Nile, but the superpower of the ancient world. As the golden light of the new kingdom faded, Egypt entered a long era of turmoil, known to historians as the post-Pyramid Age, or the Third Intermediate Period. After the reign of Ramses XI, the pharaoh's authority was no longer absolute. The rivers of power splintered into many channels, flowing toward regional warlords, military commanders, and the high priests who controlled vast wealth. The division of the two lands with the weakening of central power. The North Lower Egypt often fell under the control of dynasties established by Libyan chieftains. These Libyans had settled in the Nile Delta for generations, at first as mercenaries in the Pharaoh's service, but gradually they built their own dynasties, such as the 22nd dynasty of King Shosh. In the South Upper Egypt, particularly in Thebes, the priesthood of Amun wielded immense influence. The high priests of Karnak commanded not only great wealth from temple estates and offerings, but also military forces of their own. Egypt was no longer a single unified state, had become a patchwork of semi-independent regions, sometimes cooperating, sometimes clashing. The rise of the Nubians. To the south, Nubia, long a source of gold and elite troops for Egypt, grew into a strong and ambitious kingdom. The kingdom of Kush, with its capital at Napata, absorbed much of Egypt's culture and worshipped Egyptian gods such as Amun. When they saw Egypt divided and weak, the Nubian kings moved to intervene. King Pi marched north, defeating rival rulers and uniting all of Egypt under his crown in the 8th century BCE. This was the 25th dynasty, also called the dynasty of the Black Pharaohs. Under their reign, Egypt enjoyed a brief revival. Temples were restored, and traditional religion was renewed. But the revival would be short-lived. To the east, a new and formidable power was rising. The Assyrian Empire, and its gaze was fixed on the rich lands of the Nile. The threat from Assyria, the Assyrians, with their disciplined armies and iron weapons, were the most dangerous foe Egypt had ever faced. In 671 BCE, King Esarhaddon invaded and captured Memphis. After years of conflict, his son Ashurbanipal pushed deep into Thebes, sacking the holy city and carrying away its treasures and statues of the gods. The Nubians were driven back to their homeland. In the Delta, the Assyrians installed native puppet kings, marking the beginning of the 26th dynasty, the Saite period, with its capital at Sais. The Saite revival. Under kings such as Somtik I and Necho II, Egypt experienced a short-lived resurgence. These pharaohs re-established a degree of centralized control, reformed the army with Greek mercenaries, and expanded trade across the Mediterranean. Necho II even launched a canal project to connect the Nile to the Red Sea, and sponsored ambitious expeditions, including a voyage that may have circumnavigated Africa. Yet this balance was fragile, for in the east, a new power was emerging to replace Assyria, the Persian Empire, the shadow of Persia. In 525 BCE, Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt and defeated Pharaoh Somtik III at the Battle of Pelusium, battle famous for the story that Persian troops used cats and other sacred animals to deter Egyptian resistance. After their victory, the Persians made Egypt a satrapy, a province of their vast empire. Although there were occasional uprisings and brief periods of independence, Egypt remained under foreign rule for nearly 2 centuries. Persian satraps governed the land, imposing heavy taxes and exploiting its resources. The flicker of freedom revolts, such as that of King Amyteus' 28th dynasty, and the reigns of Nectanebo I and 230th dynasty, rekindled hope for independence. Nectanebo II, the last native pharaoh, was remembered as a temple builder and skilled military leader, but ultimately he was defeated by the Persians in 343 BCE. From then on, Egypt was again a Persian province, and the age of native pharaohs ended. Yet only a few decades later, from the west, a young man from Macedonia would arrive, Alexander the Great, and forever alter the destiny of the Nile. In the mid-4th century BCE, Egypt was still under the heavy hand of the Persian Empire. Temples paid tribute to foreign satraps, taxes drained the wealth of farmers, and the once proud memory of the pharaohs seemed like a fading echo. Yet far beyond the Nile Valley, in the rugged land of Macedonia, a young king was forging a path that would shatter empires. His name was Alexander, and his ambitions would reach from Greece to the edge of the known world. The arrival of the conqueror in 332 BCE, after defeating the Persians in Asia Minor and Syria, Alexander marched toward Egypt. For centuries, Egypt had been a prize in the game of empires, first Assyrian, then Persian, and now the young Macedonians sought to claim it. But unlike other invaders, Alexander did not face a great battle at Egypt's borders. The people, weary of Persian rule, saw in him a liberator. At Pelusium, the Persian satrap surrendered without resistance. As Alexander advanced along the Nile, he was welcomed with gifts, music, and offerings. The priests of Egypt hailed him as the rightful ruler, chosen by the gods to restore the balance and harmony of the land. Pharaoh by divine right in Memphis, Alexander was crowned pharaoh. He was proclaimed son of Ammon, adopting the ancient titles of Egypt's kings. For the Egyptians, this was not mere ceremony. It was a sacred acknowledgement that the gods themselves had chosen Alexander to rule. Seeking to strengthen his divine legitimacy, Alexander made a journey across the western desert to the Siwa oasis, where the famous oracle of Ammon resided. In the shadow of the temple's stone columns, the oracle reportedly greeted him as the son of the god himself. Whether truth or legend, the story spread swiftly, adding to his aura of destiny. The founding of Alexandria while in Egypt, Alexander envisioned a city that would be the jewel of the Mediterranean, a gateway between Greek and Egyptian worlds. On the coast, near the fishing village of Rhachitis, he marked the outline of Alexandria with grain sprinkled in the sand. Alexandria would grow into a city of marble streets, grand temples, and bustling harbors. It would be home to the great Libreria, treasure of human knowledge, and the Pharaohs lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Alexander's dream was not merely to rule Egypt, but to make it the cultural heart of his empire. The Ptolemaic dynasty. Alexander's time in Egypt was brief. In 331 BCE, he left to continue his campaign against Persia, never to return. When he died suddenly in 323 BCE, his vast empire fractured among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions and a skilled strategist. Ptolemy crowned himself pharaoh, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek rulers who would govern Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Though foreign by blood, the Ptolemies embraced Egyptian customs. They built temples to the ancient gods, participated in traditional festivals, and commissioned statues of themselves in Egyptian style. Yet in Alexandria, they ruled as Greek monarchs, blending Hellenistic culture with the heritage of the Nile, a fusion of worlds under the Ptolemies. Egypt became a crossroads of civilization. Greek philosophers debated in the shadow of Egyptian obelisks. Priests in Memphis performed rituals as they had for millennia, while scholars in the Library of Alexandria collected texts from every corner of the known world. The economy flourished through trade in grain, papyrus, linen, and luxury goods. Alexandria's harbor teemed with ships bound for Greece, Rome, and beyond. The city's lighthouse guided sailors from hundreds of miles away, a beacon of Egypt's renewed prominence. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh over time, however, the dynasty weakened through court intrigue, sibling rivalries, and the growing shadow of Rome. In 51 BCE, Cleopatra VII ascended the throne. Brilliant, politically astute, and fluent in several languages, she was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian tongue, winning the loyalty of her subjects. Cleopatra sought alliances to preserve Egypt's independence. Her liaisons with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were as much political as personal, aimed at countering Rome's expansion. Yet these alliances would entangle Egypt in Rome's civil wars. In 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium, the forces of Cleopatra and Antony were defeated by Octavian, the future Augustus. The following year, Alexandria fell. Faced with the end of her reign and the prospect of being paraded as a Roman trophy, Cleopatra chose death over humiliation. Legend says by the bite of an asp, the end of an era. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. The line of pharaohs, stretching back over 3 millennia, came to an end. Yet the legacy of the Ptolemies, like that of the pharaohs before them, would endure in stone and memory. In the temples of Luxor and Philae, Greek inscriptions stand alongside hieroglyphs. The ruins of the lighthouse and the whispers of the Library of Alexandria speak of a time when Egypt was both the heir to an ancient civilization and a beacon of the Hellenistic world. The Nile still flowed as it always had, carrying with it the stories of gods and kings, warriors and scholars, lovers and conquerors. Egypt's political power had faded, but its cultural and spiritual legacy would continue to shape the world for centuries to come. When the gates of Alexandria opened to Octavian's legions in 30 BCE, an unbroken chain of pharaohs stretching back more than 3,000 years came to an end. Egypt was no longer the sovereign realm of god-kings. It was now the personal possession of Rome's first emperor. Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, claimed Egypt not as a mere province, but as his own crown jewel, closed to the Roman Senate and ruled directly by his appointee, the prefect of Egypt. A province unlike any other. Egypt's wealth and strategic importance made it unique in the Roman Empire. Its fertile Nile Valley was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, supplying Rome with the grain that fed its swelling population. Control of Egypt meant control of one of the empire's most vital lifelines. To prevent any governor from amassing enough power to challenge him, Augustus forbade Roman senators from entering Egypt without his permission. The prefects he appointed were equestrians, men of the middle ranks of Roman society, chosen for their loyalty over their political ambition. The prefect oversaw the army, the administration, and the tax system. The Roman military presence in Egypt was strong. 3 legions were stationed in the province, alongside auxiliary troops drawn from local populations. The legionaries guarded against both desert raiders and the possibility of rebellion within. Alexandria, jewel of the Mediterranean. Under Roman rule, Alexandria retained its status as one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. Its 2 harbors bustled with merchant ships carrying grain, papyrus, glassware, and luxury goods. The Pharos lighthouse, still standing tall on the island of Pharos, guided sailors from far beyond the horizon. The Library of Alexandria, though diminished from its legendary peak, remained a center of scholarship. Greek, Egyptian, and Roman intellectuals exchanged ideas, while philosophers lectured in colonnaded courtyards. Roman emperors, eager to associate themselves with the city's prestige, sponsored public works, baths, and temples. The blending of cultures. Egypt's cultural life under Rome was a tapestry of traditions. The old gods were still worshipped. Hammon, Isis, Horus, and Osiris retained their temples and festivals, but Roman deities like Jupiter and Mars appeared alongside them. Some gods merged. The Egyptian sun god, Ra, combined with the Greek Helios and the Roman Sol into a syncretic figure honored across the empire. The cult of Isis spread far beyond the Nile, finding devotees from Britain to the Black Sea. Roman emperors even participated in the worship of Egyptian gods, using them as symbols of universal power. Life in the countryside. For most Egyptians, life under Rome was not about imperial politics, but the cycles of the Nile. Farmers sowed their fields when the floods receded and harvested under the watchful eyes of Roman tax collectors. The system of grain quotas was strict. A significant portion of the harvest was shipped to Alexandria for export to Rome. Yet the Nile Valley remained a place of continuity. The village scribes still recorded births, marriages, and property disputes in the flowing lines of Greek or Demotic script. The rhythms of rural life, fishing, weaving, tending livestock, continued much as they had for centuries. Rebellions and resistance. Roman rule was not without resistance. In 29 BCE, just a year after Octavian's conquest, a revolt broke out in Thebes, sparked by resentment against heavy taxation and foreign rule. Over the next centuries, uprisings would flare periodically, particularly in Upper Egypt, where the connection to ancient traditions was strongest. One of the most serious revolts came during the reign of Emperor Trajan in 116 CE, when Jewish communities in Alexandria and throughout the Delta rose up in what became known as the Kitos War. The violence devastated parts of the city and required significant Roman military force to suppress Egypt in the imperial imagination. To the Romans, Egypt was more than just a province. It was a place of mystery and fascination. Its colossal temples, hieroglyph-covered walls, and enigmatic sphinx spoke of an antiquity that dwarfed even Rome's own history. Emperors and nobles traveled to see the pyramids, to consult the priests, and to marvel at the monuments of the past. Roman artists decorated villas with Nile scenes, crocodiles, lotus blossoms, and pygmies navigating papyrus boats. Egyptian motifs appeared in Roman jewelry, furniture, and architecture, a sign of the deep cultural influence Egypt wielded over its conquerors. The gradual transformation over the centuries. Egypt's identity evolved under Roman rule. The old priesthoods persisted, but the spread of Greek and Latin eroded the everyday use of hieroglyphs. By the 3rd century CE, knowledge of reading and writing the ancient script was fading. Meanwhile, new ideas were taking root. Christianity began to spread through Egypt in the 1st century CE, first in Alexandria's diverse urban communities, then into the countryside. By the time of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, Egypt would be a center of Christian scholarship and monasticism, forever altering its spiritual landscape. An enduring legacy. Though Rome ruled Egypt for nearly 7 centuries longer than the time between Cleopatra and us today, it never fully erased the spirit of the land. The Nile still rose and fell. The desert still guarded the tombs of kings, and the people still carried with them the myths, symbols, and pride of their ancient past. To the Roman emperors, Egypt was the granary of the empire. To its people, it remained the gift of the Nile, a land whose soul had been shaped by gods and pharaohs long before Rome was ever a dream. By the 1st century CE, Egypt had been under Roman rule for decades. The temples still stood, the priests still tended the altars, and the ancient gods still watched over the Nile. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was beginning, one not of armies and conquests, but of faith. Seeds of a new faith. In the cosmopolitan streets of Alexandria, traders from across the Mediterranean mingled with scholars, philosophers, and sailors. It was here, tradition says, that Mark the Evangelist arrived to preach the message of Christ. To many in Egypt's Greek-speaking communities, his words carried a resonance, the promise of salvation, not just for kings or the elite, but for every soul. Christianity's message of equality before God appealed to the poor, the oppressed, and those weary of Rome's pagan rituals. By the 2nd century, small Christian communities had formed in Alexandria, in the Delta, and even in the villages along the Nile. Alexandria, a center of learning and debate as Christianity took root. Alexandria became one of its intellectual strongholds. The catechetical school of Alexandria produced great thinkers such as Clement and Origen, who blended Greek philosophy with Christian theology. Here, faith and reason intertwined in a way that would shape the entire course of Christian doctrine. But Alexandria was also a city of tension. Pagans, Jews, and Christians often lived side by side, yet religious rivalries sometimes erupted into violence. Street debates could turn into riots, and imperial authorities, wary of unrest, alternated between tolerating and persecuting the new faith. Persecution and martyrdom. Roman emperors, seeing Christianity's refusal to honor the imperial cult as a threat to unity, periodically unleashed waves of persecution. In Egypt, Christians were imprisoned, tortured, and executed for refusing to offer sacrifices to the old gods. Stories of the martyrs spread quickly, of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who defied pagan philosophers, of countless unnamed believers who met death in the arenas. Far from destroying the movement, these sacrifices only deepened the faith of those who remained, inspiring others to join despite the risk. The turning of the tide, the great shift, came in the early 4th century. Emperor Constantine, after his conversion, issued the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, granting religious tolerance to Christians throughout the empire. Churches began to rise openly in Alexandria and across Egypt. In 325 CE, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, where Egyptian bishops, most famously Athanasius of Alexandria, played a key role in defining Christian orthodoxy. Athanasius would become one of the fiercest defenders of the doctrine of Christ's divinity, a central pillar of the faith. The decline of the ancient temples. As Christianity grew, the old religion waned. Fewer pilgrims came to the temples of Ammon, Horus, and Isis. Priestly revenues dwindled. The grand processions and festivals that had once bound Egypt's cities in devotion to the gods were gradually replaced by Christian feast days. By the end of the 4th century, under Emperor Theodosius I, pagan worship was officially banned. Many temples were abandoned, their statues toppled, their sacred precincts converted into churches. Some, like the Temple of Philae, lingered for centuries as isolated sanctuaries of the old ways, but their days were numbered. The Desert Fathers in the deserts of Egypt, far from the politics of Alexandria, a new form of Christian devotion was emerging. Monasticism. Men like Anthony the Great and Pachomius withdrew from society to live lives of prayer, fasting, and solitude. Their example inspired thousands, creating entire communities of monks and nuns who saw the harsh desert as a path to spiritual purity. Egypt's deserts became dotted with monasteries, fortresses of faith, where scripture was copied, hymns were composed, and generations were trained in spiritual discipline. This monastic tradition would spread across the Christian world, from the Holy Land to Ireland. In Egypt transformed by the dawn of the 5th century, the transformation was complete. The pharaohs were long gone, the temples silent, the hieroglyphs unread. In their place stood churches crowned with crosses, and monasteries ringing with the chants of psalms. Yet echoes of the past remained. Many Christian festivals aligned with the old agricultural cycles of the Nile. Ancient symbols were reinterpreted. The Ankh, once the sign of eternal life from the gods, became a symbol of the Christian cross. Egypt was no longer the land of the ancient gods, it was now one of the heartlands of Christendom. and while empires would rise and fall, the faith that had taken root here would endure, even in the face of the next great wave of change. By the dawn of the 7th century CE, Egypt was a proud but weary land. Once the jewel of the Roman Empire, it was now part of the Byzantine Empire, ruled from Constantinople. The great cities of Alexandria and Thebes still stood, but centuries of heavy taxation, religious disputes, and imperial politics had left the land restless. Christianity had long been the faith of the people, but deep divisions had emerged within the church itself. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE split the Egyptian faithful from the imperial church over theological disputes, creating a rift between the Coptic Church and the Byzantine authorities. This religious fracture weakened imperial control and sowed resentment among the native Egyptians, resentment that would play a decisive role when a new power appeared on the horizon. A new force from the desert in the year 632 CE, the Prophet Muhammad died, leaving behind a unified Arabian peninsula and a message that was spreading with extraordinary speed: Islam. Within a decade, Arab armies fired by faith and driven by the momentum of recent victories, swept out of Arabia into the Byzantine and Sassanid empires. In 639 CE, the Muslim commander, Amr ibn al-Ji, received orders from the Caliph Umar ibn al-Kok to lead an army into Egypt, with perhaps only 4,000 to 5,000 men at first. Amr advanced across the Sinai, moving swiftly to exploit the divisions and discontent simmering under Byzantine rule. The march to Babylon fortress. Byzantine forces, commanded by the general Theodorus, withdrew 2 strongholds along the Nile. The most important of these was the Babylon fortress, located near present-day Cairo, guarding the route into Upper Egypt. The siege of Babylon was long and grueling. For months, the Arabs probed the fortress walls, negotiated with the defenders, and slowly cut off supplies. Meanwhile, Amr's ranks swelled with reinforcements from Arabia. Local Copts, resentful of Byzantine religious persecution, often provided intelligence and logistical support to the invaders. By April 641 CE, the Byzantines agreed to terms. The fortress gates opened, and the Arab banners of the Rashidun Caliphate rose over its towers. The fall of Alexandria. With Babylon secured, Amr marched north to Alexandria, the great coastal capital and the last bastion of Byzantine power in Egypt. The city's walls were formidable, and its harbor protected by the mighty Pharaohs lighthouse, but morale was low. Cut off from reinforcements by sea due to Arab naval victories, the Byzantines faced a relentless siege. In September 642 CE, Alexandria surrendered. After more than 900 years as a Greco-Roman metropolis, the city now belonged to a new empire. Egypt, once the breadbasket of Rome, became a province of the Islamic Caliphate. The founding of Fustat, rather than rule from Alexandria, Amr chose to establish a new capital inland, near the Babylon fortress. Here, he founded the city of Fustat, the first Islamic capital of Egypt. Its streets were lined with houses of mud brick. Markets thrived with goods from Arabia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. And at its heart stood the mosque of Amr ibn al-Giza, first mosque in Africa. From Fustat, the Arabs governed Egypt as a province of the Caliphate, collecting taxes, maintaining order, and ensuring the steady flow of grain and revenue to Medina and later Damascus, the new capital of the Umayyad dynasty. Religious and cultural change. The Arab conquest did not immediately erase Egypt's Christian identity. The majority of the population remained Coptic Christian for centuries, and the Coptic Church continued to function. However, Arabic gradually replaced Greek and Coptic as the language of administration. Over generations, many Egyptians converted to Islam, drawn by faith, social mobility, and relief from certain taxes imposed on non-Muslims. The blending of Arab and Egyptian cultures produced a new identity. Muslim Egyptians who preserved elements of their ancient heritage within the framework of Islamic civilization. The Nile under new rule. The Caliphate quickly recognized the Nile's vital role in feeding its expanding empire. Grain shipments once bound for Rome now sailed to the Arabian heartlands and to the growing cities of the Islamic world. Engineers maintained and improved the canal systems, ensuring that Egypt remained a center of agricultural abundance. Trade flourished as well. From Fustat, caravans carried spices, gold, and textiles across the desert, while ships in Alexandria's harbor linked Egypt to the Mediterranean trade networks. The end of the Byzantine era. For the Byzantines, the loss of Egypt was a staggering blow. It deprived them of their richest province and their main grain supply, hastening the empire's decline. For the Arabs, Egypt was both a prize and a gateway to North Africa, to the Mediterranean, and to the wealth of the wider world. By the close of the 7th century, the transformation was irreversible. The temples of the old gods were long silent, the imperial eagles of Rome and Byzantium had been lowered, and the crescent banner of Islam now flew over the two lands. Egypt had entered a new chapter, one that would last, in various forms, for more than a millennium. When the banners of Islam first flew over Egypt in the mid-7th century, the land of the Nile entered a new political and cultural order. The armies of the Rashidun Caliphate had come as conquerors, but Egypt's fertile fields, bustling ports, and strategic location soon made it one of the most prized provinces in the Islamic world. Across the next 6 centuries, Egypt would pass under the rule of several great caliphates, Rashidun, Umayyad, and Fatimid, each leaving its mark on the land's identity, architecture, and soul. Under the Rashidun caliphs 642 to 661 CE, in the early years after conquest, Egypt was governed from Fustat, the new inland capital founded by Amr ibn al-G. The city was modest by the standards of Alexandria's marble avenues, but it pulsed with life. Its markets overflowed with goods from Arabia, Nubia, and the Mediterranean. At its heart stood the Mosque of Amr ibn al-G, the first mosque in Africa, a place of worship and a symbol of Islam's arrival on the Nile. The Rashidun rulers allowed the Coptic Christian majority to continue practicing their faith, though they paid the jizya tax as non-Muslims. Many Copts found the new rulers more tolerant than the Byzantine emperors, who had persecuted them over theological disputes. This fragile peace allowed Egypt's economy to recover quickly after the disruption of war. The Umayyad era 661 to 750 CE. The assassination of Caliph Alq in 661 ushered in the Umayyad Caliphate, ruling from Damascus. Under the Umayyads, Egypt's role as a granary expanded dramatically. Shipments of grain, flax, and papyrus sailed north to feed the empire's growing cities. Arabic replaced Greek as the official language of administration, a change that would, over centuries, reshape Egypt's cultural identity. The Arab-Muslim population grew, both through migration from Arabia and gradual conversion among Egyptians. Fustat flourished as an administrative hub, but the coastal city of Alexandria remained vital to trade, linking Egypt to the wider Mediterranean. However, repeated Byzantine attempts to recapture the city prompted the Umayyads to strengthen Egypt's coastal defenses, turning Alexandria into a fortress port. The Abbasid transition 750–969 CE. In 750, the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads and moved the Caliphate's capital to Baghdad. Egypt now lay at the empire's far western edge, but its wealth ensured it remained central to Abbasid strategy. The Abbasids appointed Governor Swalis to oversee Egypt, but distance from Baghdad gave these officials unusual autonomy. Some governors became semi-independent rulers, raising their own armies and minting coins in their name. Among them, Ahmad ibn Tulun stands out. In 868, Ibn Tulun founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt in practice, though still nominally under Abbasid suzerainty. He built the Mosque of Ibn Tulun in Fustat, a masterpiece of early Islamic architecture that still stands today. His administration invested in irrigation canals, restoring prosperity to the countryside. After the Tulunids came the Exudids, another semi-autonomous dynasty, until the arrival of a new force from the west would transform Egypt once again. The Fatimids. The Fatimid Caliphate, 969 to 1171 CE. In 969 CE, the Fatimids, a Shia dynasty, claiming descent from the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, marched from North Africa into Egypt. Their general Johar el-Sakili captured Fustat without a battle and founded a new capital to the north, Al-Qahira the Victorious, known to the world as Cairo. Cairo quickly became the jewel of the Fatimid realm. Its palaces, markets, and mosques were laid out with precision, reflecting both political ambition and religious devotion. The Al-Azhar Mosque, founded in 970, became a center of learning that would, over centuries, grow into one of the most influential universities in the Islamic world. Under the Fatimids, Egypt's wealth reached dazzling heights. The Nile's harvests fed not just Cairo, but much of the Mediterranean. Caravans laden with gold, ivory, and spices arrived from the African interior, while fleets carried Egyptian grain and textiles to markets as far as Sicily and Yemen. The Fatimids also presided over a flourishing of art and culture. Jewelry, textiles, and manuscripts of exquisite craftsmanship flowed from Cairo's workshops. Science, philosophy, and medicine thrived under their patronage. Yet their Shia faith set them apart from the Sunni majority in Egypt, sometimes fueling sectarian tensions. The end of Fatimid rule by the 12th century. Internal strife and external threats weakened the Fatimids. The Crusaders, having established kingdoms in the Levant, eyed Egypt as the richest prize in the region. Fatimid viziers, desperate for allies, invited the Kurdish general Saladin, serving the Sunni Zengid dynasty, to help repel Crusader advances. Saladin did more than defend Egypt. In 1171, he ended the Fatimid Caliphate, restored Sunni rule under the Abbasid Caliph's nominal authority, and founded the Ayyubid dynasty. His rise marked the close of Egypt's era under the Great Caliphates, and the beginning of a new chapter, one where Egypt would become the bulwark of Islam against the Crusades. In the year 1169 CE, Egypt stood at a crossroads. The once mighty Fatimid Caliphate was but a shadow of its former glory, plagued by internal intrigue, sectarian strife, and the looming threat of Crusader invasion from the east. Into this fragile and fractured realm rode Kalok ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin, a Kurdish general whose name would become synonymous with honor, unity, and resistance. The call to defend Egypt. Saladin had come to Egypt as part of a mission ordered by Enchar ad-Din Zenk, the Sunni ruler of Syria, to aid the Fatimids against the Crusaders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. At the time, Egypt's Vizier Shirkuh, Saladin's uncle, led the campaign, with Saladin serving as his trusted lieutenant. When Shirkuh died suddenly in 1169, the 31-year-old Saladin was unexpectedly appointed vizier. Few could have predicted that this young general, a Sunni in a Shia court, would soon reshape Egypt's destiny. The end of the Fatimids. Saladin moved cautiously at first, consolidating his position while reforming Egypt's administration. He won the loyalty of key military commanders, reduced the influence of corrupt court officials, and began strengthening Egypt's defenses. In 1171, with Enchar ad-Din's blessing, Saladin formally abolished the Fatimid Caliphate. The Khutbah, the Friday sermon, was once again read in the name of the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. This act ended over 2 centuries of Shia Fatimid rule and brought Egypt back into the Sunni fold. Saladin had effectively founded the Ayyubid dynasty, named after his father, Ayyubid. Forging a united front, Saladin understood that Egypt could not stand alone against the Crusaders. He began a program of military expansion, building a fleet to challenge the Crusader ports and fortifying Cairo with massive stone walls. The citadel of Cairo, perched atop the Mokattam hills, rose as a symbol of his authority and a fortress against invasion. Beyond military works, Saladin worked to unify Egypt and Syria under his own command. After the death of Enchar ad-Din in 1174, through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and military campaigns, he brought Damascus, Aleppo, and other key cities into his realm, creating a powerful state stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. The Crusader threat, the Crusader states, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli watched Saladin's rise with alarm. They launched raids into Egypt, but found themselves repelled by his reorganized army. Saladin, however, was not content with mere defense. In 1187, after years of preparation, he struck decisively. At the Battle of Warkin, his forces encircled and annihilated the Crusader army, capturing King Guy of Jerusalem and reclaiming the True Cross, a relic of immense symbolic value to the Crusaders. Within months, Saladin's banners flew over Jerusalem. The city surrendered peacefully after negotiations. Avoiding the massacre that had accompanied the Crusader conquest in 1099, Saladin allowed Christian residents to ransom their freedom and safeguarded the city's holy sites, earning him a reputation for chivalry even among his enemies. Egypt, at the heart of the Ayyubid Empire. Though Jerusalem was the jewel of his victories, Egypt remained the economic and strategic heart of Saladin's empire. The fertile Nile Valley provided the grain that fed his armies, while Alexandria and Damietta connected the realm to Mediterranean trade. Saladin encouraged learning and religious scholarship. Madrasas, colleges for Sunni Islamic study, were established throughout Cairo, reinforcing orthodox Sunni doctrine after centuries of Fatimid Shia influence. Artisans and architects flourished under Ayyubid patronage, producing mosques, citadels, and markets that transformed the urban landscape. The Third Crusade. Saladin's triumphs inevitably provoked a response from Europe. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, brought the might of Kings Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa against the Ayyubid Empire. The conflict was fierce. Richard the Lionheart retook Acre and defeated Saladin's forces at Arsif, but failed to recapture Jerusalem. Despite the stalemate, the two leaders developed a mutual respect. In 1192, they agreed to a truce. The Crusaders would hold a coastal strip from Jaffa to Tyre, while Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, with Christian pilgrims granted access to holy sites. Saladin's final days. Saladin returned to Damascus, ruling over an empire that, at its height, stretched from Yemen to the borders of Anatolia. Yet he lived simply, giving away much of his wealth in charity. When he died in 1193, his treasury was so empty that there was barely enough to pay for his burial. In Egypt, his legacy endured, not only in the fortifications and institutions he built, but in the sense of unity he had forged between the Nile and the Levant. The Ayyubid dynasty he founded would rule Egypt for decades, until supplanted by a new warrior elite, the When Saladin's Ayyubid dynasty reached its zenith in the 12th and early 13th centuries, Egypt stood as the beating heart of the Islamic world. Yet, within the ranks of its armies, a new power was rising, a force of slave soldiers whose loyalty, discipline, and martial skill would one day give them control of the very throne they served. These were the Mamluks. The rise of the slave soldiers. The Mamluks were not ordinary slaves, purchased as boys from the Turkic steppes of Central Asia, the Caucasus, or the shores of the Black Sea. They were brought to Egypt to be trained in the arts of war. Cut off from their homelands, they formed a brotherhood bound by loyalty to their comrades and their patrons. Their training was relentless. Archery from horseback, swordsmanship, military strategy, and the discipline of the barracks. By the time they took their place in the army, they were elite warriors loyal, not to the general population, but to the cause itself and the sultan they served. Under the later Ayyubid rulers, Mamluks became the backbone of Egypt's military. They guarded the palaces, manned the citadels, and led the cavalry charges that broke enemy lines. But as their influence grew, so did their political ambition. The fall of the Ayyubids. By the mid-13th century, the Ayyubid dynasty was weakened by internal rivalries and external threats. In 1249, the Seventh Crusade, led by Louis IX of France, struck Egypt, capturing Damietta and threatening Cairo itself. It was the Mamluks who rose to the challenge. Under the command of Fakhr ad-Din and later Baybars al-Bundakhdari, they outmaneuvered the Crusaders and captured King Louis IX at Mansura in 1250. This victory not only saved Egypt, it transformed the political landscape. When the Ayyubid Sultan died soon after, a power vacuum opened. The Mamluks, already in control of the army and the capital, seized the moment. Led by Shajar al-Dawla, the widow of the late Sultan, and her Mamluk allies, they established a new regime, the Mamluk Sultanate. A unique system of rule, the Mamluk Sultanate, 1250 to 1517, was unlike any other in the medieval world. Its rulers were former slaves, often foreigners by birth, who rose to power through merit and military skill, rather than noble lineage. Power was held by a small military elite, and succession was not hereditary. When a sultan died or was deposed, the emirs, the senior Mamluk commanders, would choose one of their own to take the throne. This created a volatile political system, but one that allowed talented leaders to rise quickly. The Mongol threat, barely a decade after the Mamluks took power. The greatest threat in centuries loomed over the Islamic world. The Mongols, having already destroyed Baghdad in 1258, Hulagu Khan's armies swept towards Syria and Palestine. Cities fell in their path, and the world trembled at their reputation for unstoppable conquest. In 1260, the Mongol advance reached Ain Jalut in the Jezreel Valley. There, Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant general Baybars faced them in battle. The Mamluk cavalry, masters of mounted archery and lightning maneuvers, outflanked and shattered the Mongol army. This victory was the first major defeat the Mongols had suffered in open battle, halting their westward expansion and securing Egypt's role as the defender of the Islamic world. Baybars, the Lion of Egypt. After Ain Jalut, Baybars seized the throne and began one of the most dynamic reigns in Mamluk history. He fortified Egypt's borders, rebuilt its defenses, and launched campaigns to reclaim Crusader strongholds along the coast. Baybars also established a postal relay system across his realm, enabling swift communication between Cairo and distant provinces. He invited scholars and artisans to Cairo, making the city a center of learning and culture. Under his rule, the Mamluk Sultanate became the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean. Defenders of Islam for nearly 2 centuries, the Mamluks waged war against the remnants of the Crusader states. One by one, they captured Acre, Tripoli, and other coastal cities, until the last Crusader fortress fell in 1291. Egypt now stood unchallenged as the leading power in the Levant. The Mamluks also secured the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, ensuring the safety of pilgrims making the Hajj. Control over these sacred sites enhanced their prestige and cemented their legitimacy as rulers of the Islamic world. Cairo, the beating heart under the Mamluks. Cairo blossomed into one of the richest and most beautiful cities of the medieval world. The wealth of the spice trade flowed through its markets, connecting India, Africa, and Europe. Monumental mosques, madrasas, and caravanserais rose along its streets, adorned with intricate stonework and towering minarets. Cairo was not only a political capital, but a cultural beacon. Scholars debated theology and law, poets recited verses in palace courts, and craftsmen produced exquisite metalwork, glass, and textiles. The long decline, yet the same system that allowed the Mamluks to rise, also sowed the seeds of their decline. Political instability, frequent coups, and the constant need to buy and train new recruits strained the state's resources. In the late 15th century, the rise of European maritime powers disrupted Egypt's trade routes. Portuguese ships bypassed the Red Sea, cutting into the spice trade that had enriched Cairo for centuries. The final blow came from the north. In 1516 to 1517, the Ottoman Empire, under Selim I, invaded. At the Battle of Radania, the Mamluks fought valiantly but were defeated. Cairo fell, and Egypt became an Ottoman province. The year was 1517. On the dusty plain of Radania, the banners of the Mamluk Sultanate fell before the armies of the Ottoman Sultan, Selim I. The battle was fierce, but the Mamluk warriors, who had defied Crusaders and Mongols, could not withstand the firepower and disciplined ranks of the Ottoman janissaries and artillery. Cairo itself was taken within days, and the last Mamluk Sultan, Chuman Bey II, was executed before the gates of the city. For the first time since Alexander the Great's conquest, nearly 18 centuries earlier, Egypt became part of a vast empire not ruled from within its borders. The Ottoman Empire, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the Arabian deserts, now claimed the land of the Nile. A new order Selim I understood Egypt's value immediately. Not only was it the breadbasket of the Eastern Mediterranean, it also held the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which the Ottomans now claimed to protect. By bringing Egypt under Ottoman control, Selim cemented his role as caliph, leader of the Muslim world. The Mamluks were not entirely swept away. Recognizing their deep roots and military skill, the Ottomans allowed many to retain their status as provincial beys and cavalry commanders. Egypt became an Eyalet province, governed by an Ottoman pasha in Cairo, supported and often rivaled by the powerful Mamluk elite. This uneasy partnership would define Egyptian politics for centuries. The pasha representing Istanbul's authority, the beys wielding influence in the streets and countryside. Cairo, under Ottoman rule, Cairo remained one of the largest cities in the Islamic world. Its skyline a forest of minarets and domes. Ottoman governors refurbished old mosques, built new fountains and caravanserais, and restored markets. The Khan el-Khalili Bazaar thrived as a hub of trade, filled with spices from India, coffee from Yemen, gold from Sudan, and silks from Anatolia. Yet while Egypt's economy remained vital, it no longer directed its own destiny. Orders came from Istanbul. Taxes and grain flowed northward to feed the Ottoman heartlands. The great fleets that once sailed from Alexandria to Venice were now regulated under imperial monopoly. The decline of the Nile's trade monopoly for centuries. Egypt's position astride the Red Sea and Mediterranean made it the crossroads of east-west commerce. But in the late 16th century, European maritime powers Portugal, first, then the Dutch and English began sailing directly to India and beyond, bypassing the Red Sea entirely. This shift weakened Egypt's role as the middleman of global trade. The spice caravans grew fewer, and the great wealth of the Mamluk era diminished. Still, Egypt remained indispensable as a source of grain and as a strategic link between the Ottoman domains in Africa and Arabia. The persistence of the Mamluks, although officially under Ottoman rule, Egypt often behaved like a semi-autonomous state. The Mamluk Beys, organized into powerful households, continued to dominate local politics. Rival factions frequently clashed in Cairo's streets, and at times the Ottoman governor was little more than a figurehead. In the countryside, Mamluk tax collectors maintained control over villages, drawing revenue both for themselves and for the empire. This dual authority bred instability, but also ensured that Egyptian society retained many of its old structures beneath the Ottoman veneer. Cultural life and continuity under Ottoman patronage, Cairo remained a center of Islamic scholarship. Al-Azhar University continued to train scholars in law, theology, and Arabic literature, drawing students from as far as West Africa and Central Asia. Craftsmen produced exquisite inlaid woodwork, brassware, and textiles, blending Ottoman and Mamluk styles. Religious life flourished in a mosaic of Sufi orders, scholarly circles, and popular festivals that echoed ancient seasonal rhythms. The Nile's annual flood was still celebrated, just as it had been for thousands of years, though now with Islamic blessings instead of offerings to Hopi. The long decline by the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire itself was weakening, and Egypt felt the strain. Corruption, factionalism, and heavy taxation burdened the population. Plagues and famines struck periodically, thinning the crowded streets of Cairo. The once proud Ottoman garrisons grew complacent, while the Mamluks regained much of their former independence. In this climate, foreign powers began to take an interest. French and British traders eyed Egypt's strategic position. It was only a matter of time before Egypt's fate would again be decided by armies from beyond its borders. The legacy of the ancient land under the Ottomans, Egypt did not recapture the imperial glory of the Pharaohs, the Ptolemies, or the Mamluks, yet it remained the cultural and economic heart of the Arab world, a place where ancient traditions met Ottoman governance, where the minarets of Cairo rose over streets that had been walked by Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Turks. The Ottomans preserved Egypt's role as guardian of the holy cities, center of Islamic scholarship, and breadbasket of the Mediterranean. But the centuries-old pattern remained. Egypt's destiny was shaped by those who ruled it from afar, even as its people quietly maintained their own identity, rooted in a civilization older than any empire. When Napoleon's French army landed on Egypt's shores in 1798, the Ottoman era was already in decline. Yet the Egypt he sits monuments, its bustling markets, its resilient people was still unmistakably the heir to thousands of years of history. The river still rose, the desert still guarded its secrets, and the legacy of the ancient land endured.